Hello friends, my name's Emile and welcome back to another episode of the Forza Top Gear Laps. Today we are taking a look at executive cars. Now these are the cars you buy if you are a rich businessman or if you just want to travel around in style. These are the chariots of choice for those more successful than others. We start with the Audi RS7 Sportback, 552 horsepower, 4,310 pounds of weight. The RS7 Sportback is one of my favourite modern Audis. I really do kind of like this vehicle. Lock up a bit into the first corner, but it actually probably helped the car out a little bit. That first corner was a bit of an issue when it came to these vehicles. Now, as you'd expect, most of these vehicles are very, very heavy. 4,310 pounds actually makes this about average for what we've got here today, whereas before it would have been one of the heavier vehicles. And as such, yeah, it did have some slight issues when it came to understeer. The RS7's biggest issue for me is it has a strange gearbox, very similar to the A45 AMG. The gears are very, very short in this vehicle, a bit too short. You do use first once or twice around here, but it's really best to avoid it and just stick with second. The problem with second is you do get a boatload of understeer at lower speed, so yeah, trying to find the right balance with the RS7 was a little bit hard. Also, there was a few problem areas on the track, the first corner, the hammerhead, and indeed coming out of the tyres as well. There were some issues when it came to these vehicles. However, the RS7 was pretty decent and very, very quick. We move on to the Mercedes-Benz E63 AMG, 577 horsepower, 4,277 pounds of weight. This was probably one of the nicer vehicles here today. Definitely out of the four-wheel drive vehicles, this was the nicest one I drove. Pretty decent vehicle overall, the E63. It's actually deceptively quick. I mean, 577 horsepower is a decent amount, and it doesn't actually weigh all that much when it comes to these four-door vehicles. Couple that to the fact it's four-wheel drive, and you have a relatively quick vehicle, and it drives pretty nicely. Now, the thing that I found with most of these vehicles is you actually couldn't really feel the weight of them that much, which is kind of surprising. I remember driving these back in Season 2, and there was some issues when it came to the weight, but to be honest with you, in Forza Motorsport 6 at least, most of the cars don't feel nearly as weighty as they did in Forza 5, and as such these class of vehicles drive much better than they did back in Forza Motorsport 5. But yeah, the E63 was a pretty decent vehicle. Got one of the better power to weight ratios here today. Couple that again is four-wheel drive, so it gets decent traction, and you have a pretty decent vehicle on your hands. Next up, we've got another Audi. This is the RS6, 570 horsepower, 4,376 pounds of weight. I wanted to throw the RS6 in here, because we haven't had that many big Audis around. The RS7's actually the only big Audi I think we've had around so far. And of course, the RS6 has the V10 engine out of an Audi R8 in it, which means it sounds absolutely fantastic. I believe there's a couple of differences here and there when it comes to the actual engine itself, but this is essentially the same unit that you'd find in that vehicle. 570 horsepower means it is one of the more powerful vehicles here today. In fact, out of all the four-door vehicles here today, it is the most powerful. However, it's not quite as quick as you'd think. It actually feels relatively slow when you're actually driving it. The RS7, which has less power, feels much quicker than the RS6 does, which is a little bit strange. Now, another thing is this vehicle is a little bit on the understeery side. It's not great, but it isn't bad, especially for, you know, this is almost a big limo of sense. I mean, the only vehicle bigger than this is the S8, which unfortunately we don't have here in Forza Motorsport 6. But the RS6 was decent enough. I just had a couple of issues with it, and I wish it was a little bit quicker in a straight line. And our final four-door vehicle of the day is the Lexus IS350F Sport, 306 horsepower, 3,593 pounds of weight. Now, we're not really expecting this to compete with any of the vehicles you just saw. However, I wanted to throw the Lexus in here because I feel it's a bit of a forgotten car. This vehicle was actually introduced in Forza Motorsport 6. This is the new model of the Lexus IS, and it is a pretty decent vehicle overall. I mean, the IS350, the modern styling of the Lexuses, I don't understand what they're trying to do with them. They look very, very odd. This and the RCF both look odd. I think this looks worse than the RCF does. But the IS is best described as neutral handling. It is rear-wheel drive. It has the least amount of power here today, however it is the lightest vehicle here today, although not by that much. So we're not really expecting this to compete with the vehicles you've just seen, but I was kind of curious to see what sort of time this could set. Yeah, pretty neutral handling car, did pretty decently well overall, nowhere near as quick as anything else here today. I mean, it's down almost 130 horsepower on the next least powerful vehicle here today, so not exactly great when it came to its power ratings, and class wise this is a C-class vehicle, whilst most of the ones here today are B and A class vehicles. But nevertheless, the IS350 was a decent enough vehicle to drive. We move on to coupes now, sort of executive coupes. And we start it with the Bentley Continental GT, 617 horsepower, 5,115 pounds of weight. This is the heaviest vehicle here today. It's also the most powerful vehicle here today. 617 horsepower is an awful lot. 5,115 pounds is an awful lot of weight. It actually surprises me just how heavy this thing is, especially compared to the rest of the vehicles here. I mean, the RS6 is the next heaviest vehicle, and this weighs almost 1,000 pounds more than that does, which is pretty insane. Continental, though, to drive, again, you don't really feel too much of the weight in this vehicle. The best way to describe this is it's alright. It's a bit understeery, it's a bit wallowy. The brakes are pretty decent on this, which I was not expecting. I was expecting this vehicle to have some of the worst brakes here today. But it actually didn't. They were pretty decent, especially for the weight of the vehicle and the amount of power and all the sort of velocity they'd have to stop. But yeah, brakes are pretty decent. Car overall is alright to drive. It isn't a race car. You know, this isn't going to compete with your Ferraris or your Lamborghinis, but for what it isn't bad. I would definitely like to do some weight reduction to it though. Next up, we've got the Maserati Granturismo S, 433 horsepower, 4,146 pounds. Another car which is scarily heavy. I mean, it's not as heavy as the four-door vehicles, but 4,146 pounds, that is an awful lot for what this vehicle is. 433 horsepower means it's the second least powerful vehicle here today. Again, that's by leaps and bounds. I mean, it's almost 120 horsepower down on the next least powerful vehicle. So, yeah, the Lexus and the Maserati are a little bit outclassed here. But the Maserati, similar to the Lexus, it was pretty neutral to drive. It didn't really have many tendencies. It wasn't particularly understeery, it wasn't oversteery, it wasn't perfect, it wasn't what I'd describe as amazingly good to drive, but it was decent enough. The Gran Turismo is also relatively quick. This vehicle is on the lower end of B class, but it certainly isn't like a slouch. It's relatively decently speedy. The handling is good. It's just a bit of a shame you don't really see much more of the Gran Turismo when it comes to Forza 6. This car sort of is another one similar to the Lexus, which has sort of been forgotten about, and it's a bit of a wild card. But still, the Gran Turismo is not that bad at all. I should have really checked the price of this vehicle, because if it's under 100,000 credits, it's not a bad vehicle. And finally today, another wild card. This is the Cadillac CTS-V Coupe. 556 horsepower, 3,931 pounds of weight. Second least weighty vehicle here today, which it's strange saying that about a Cadillac with a great stonking V8. This thing makes an absolutely amazing noise. It's beautiful when it comes to its noise. However, that's the only thing going for it. The front end's nice, the rear end is very, very strange. I don't really like the CTS-V Coupe. I'd rather have the CTS-V sedan, because it looks so much better than the Coupe does. But despite that, the CTS, well, it drives like a muscle car. This vehicle actually drives kind of similar to the Cobra that we had round last week. It's very, very muscle car-y. This is how you'd expect a muscle car to drive. The other thing with the CTS-V is it has horrendous brakes. The brakes on this thing are not good at all. They are awful. Straight line speed-wise, probably rivaling the Continental for quickest vehicle of the day when it came to its straight line speed. This thing was monstrously quick. However, through the corners, it just was not a good vehicle to drive at all. This is definitely a weighty feeling vehicle. But nevertheless, the CTS-V is a bit of fun. It's like the Cobra, it's a fun vehicle, but it's definitely not a racing vehicle. Onto the times, and the Mercedes E63 was the fastest vehicle of the day with a 120.335, which is extremely quick. I mean, that beats out a Ferrari 250LM, beats out a Tesla, a Lotus, is not too far off an Aston Martin, a Porsche Cayman. That's a quick time. Moving down, the RS7 Sportback goes into 88th with a 121.119. Kind of strange that it's actually slower than the RS4 Avant, which you wouldn't really expect. The Continental GT goes into 94th with a 121.734, which isn't too bad. I mean, the RS7 beat a C63 S, the Continental beat a Hellcat, which I guess they're kind of similar when it comes to their statistics. Moving down the board, the RS6 goes into 99th with a 122.310, saving it from an XFRS and a Shelby GT500. The Cadillac CTS-V Coupe goes into 105th with a 122.753, and the Maserati Granturismo goes into 106th with a 122.838. Those vehicles are extremely similar when it comes to lap times, which is kind of surprising. And finally today, the Lexus IS350. Well, it didn't quite have the power of the other vehicles. A 127.285 still isn't a bad time. I mean, it beats out a Mitsubishi GTO, a Ford Focus ST, a Dodge Dart, Plymouth Prowler. Not too far off a G-Class Mercedes either, so it was a decent enough showing for the Lexus. So overall, then, these vehicles were actually pretty decent to drive. It's not something I was expecting to say at the end of this episode. Anyways, friends, I want to thank you all very much for watching. As always, if you've got any themes or suggestions for vehicles you'd like to see go around the Top Gear test track, leave them in the comment section below and I will read them. Anyways, friends, I want to thank you all very much for watching. My name's been the Real Emile, and until next time, farewell.